Hello, I'm Tyler Thompson, aka Space Explained, and welcome to another video. Space exploration has intrigued people all over the world for decades. From NASA's Saturn V to SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, tons of attention has been drawn to rockets and space exploration. In this video, I'll go over how uncommon space exploration really is, how much launches have increased over the last few years, and how much they will keep increasing. I'll go over lots of numbers and then try to make a pretty good summary. Anyways, let's get started. Just this year, there have already been 55 orbital launch attempts with 2 failures. To put that in comparison, by this point last year, there had only been 44 launches with 6 failures. Do note, though, that most of my numbers will not contain suborbital launches. So, since we have been flying rockets to orbit since 1957, us humans have a lot of rocket launches under our belts. Even still, in total, there have only been 6,060 launches, ever. This number alone puts into perspective how rare rocket launches are still today. Now, I've made a graph showing all the launches from 1957 to 2020. You can see that the rate of launches quickly spiked from only 3 launches in 1957 to 1967, which still has the highest count of launches in a year with 139. The amount of launches per year then starts to decrease drastically, getting as low as 54 in 2004. We can also see that around 2013, the amount of launches per year starts to steadily increase. One interesting thing about this timing is that this was around the same time that SpaceX started launching rapidly. And 2 years later, in 2015, they land the very first Falcon 9. I really don't think that this is a coincidence that the numbers started to rise as soon as SpaceX and the commercial industry got their mojo going, because they account for most of the launches that we see nowadays, especially SpaceX and China's space program, CNSA. Now, one aspect of using some of the most complex inventions that humans have ever made is that it will likely fail, and quite spectacularly when it does. I mean, you're carrying hundreds of tons of highly explosive substances while riding a controlled explosion while using insanely complex technology that literally requires billions of parts to work together and work right. And if that isn't a recipe for disaster, I don't know what it is. Anyways, failures are a big thing when they happen, but how common are they? Well, for sure, they are less common now than they were back in the 60s, but yet again, this graph shows us how much the failure rate has changed over the years. Obviously, back in the pioneer days of rocketry, there were a lot of failures. The most failures that we saw in one year came in 1961, with 23 failures to 50 launches, giving that year a failure rate of 46%. Compare that to 2020, which actually had a relatively high failure rate when compared to the earlier years, of around 8.8%, with 10 failures and 114 launches. So now that we have figured out the amount of failures and total launches, we can figure out the failure to success ratio. Now, I was a little surprised on how this data turned out because I expected it to look something like the opposite of the total launches graph, because if you are launching less, there are still failures happening, but since you have less launches occurring, the failures make a bigger difference in the ratio. But I was surprised to learn that the graph turned out to have a lot of similarity to the failures per year graph. It is crazy to think, though, that back in the early days of rocketry, the chances of success were hanging around 50-50. Even when the Saturn V started launching, the chances of success were hanging around the 50% range. By the time Skylab launched in 1973, however, the failure to success ratio had dropped all the way down to 7%. The failure to success ratio hovered around the 7 to 10% area, then dropped all the way down to the current record of 1% failure rate in 1989. It then shot back up to 5 to 7% area, and it hovers there still to this day. So this next segment is about plans for the future, so this will mostly be my insight based on the information that we have already gathered. So nonetheless, here we go. There's no doubt in my mind that space exploration is super cool, but based on all the data that we have seen, it seems to fluctuate based on the public's interest in space. For example, you can see that during the Apollo era, millions of people watched as the Soviet Union and America raced to put the first unmanned things into LEO, then humans, and finally bringing humans to the moon. Subsequently, because the public's interest in space was so high, the amount of rockets being launched hit an all-time high, some of the highest numbers still to this day. The public's interest stayed high until it started to wane around the 1990s. Because of this, we saw the amount of rocket launches per year decrease drastically. It stayed well below the hundreds until it just recently, starting about 2015-ish, the public's interest started to grow again due to new and exciting innovations, such as propulsive landing and the new space race between commercial companies to achieve what no one else has. And with the new goal set to colonizing Moon and the Mars, the public's interest has increased drastically. I am predicting that we are just in the beginning of a new era of space exploration, and I also think that in the coming years, we'll see plenty of records broken across the spectrum. Anyways, all my sources are in the description below as always, and you can follow me at Space Explained on Twitter, and the same thing goes for Instagram. My new website, Space Explained Website Version 1, is also linked in the description in case you want to check out my scripts and learn a little bit more about me. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and do whatever you can to help me end the general public's ignorance to our space. I'm Space Explained, explaining space like never before.